Hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. My name is Brittany. Thank you so much for stopping by. Today I have another episode of my Grassland Grove Zoo as I play my way through Planet Zoo. Say that 5 times fast. In this episode I'm going to be separating the Springbok and the Sable Antelope from the Savannah Dome, which is that massive dome structure in the background there. Before I walk you through what I'm doing in game at the moment, I guess I'll give you an explanation as to why I'm separating these animals, especially since I spent so much time on the Savannah Dome and it looks so cool. The animals actually really love being together in this habitat. It gives them an interspecies enrichment bonus, which is great because it keeps them happy. The issue that I did not foresee when I built this massive habitat is that the Springbok, the Sable Antelope, and the Thomson Gazelle, forgot about them, the Thomson Gazelle as well, they have very shy temperaments, which is problematic when you build an extremely popular habitat for guests, because naturally it's going to attract a huge number of guests into the viewing areas. And if you're not careful and specifically create the habitat to be shy animal friendly, which I did not do, the animals will just constantly be super duper stressed out. Obviously we don't want that for ethical reasons, but it's also just incredibly annoying to have constant notifications be popping up while you're trying to play the game. Okay, so now that I've given you that very lengthy explanation, not that you asked for it of course, let me go over what I've been working on in the game. I've built out this massive awning that pops out of the Savannah Dome. It has two purposes. The first is that it's going to be the hard shelter for the animals. The second is that it adds a little bit more visual interest to the Savannah Dome. Before I built the awning, the dome didn't have a lot to it on the exterior. It's really nice on the interior, but it really felt like it was missing something on the exterior. Once I finished building the general structure of the awning, I obviously needed to fill in the gaps in the top so that it would actually be a roof. And because of the angle of the awning and how it follows the dome's curvature, roofing this was not going to be easy because I couldn't use any of the standard roof tiles. Instead, I had to go in with the plaster boards and manually add them in to create the roof. It was very easy to figure out which color I wanted to use for the roofing though, because obviously I had the dome as a reference point and the dome uses a lot of light colors. So I went with this lovely light gray color for the plaster. I hadn't used plaster yet for the dome. I used glass breeze block and those wooden planks for the dome. Okay, so this next part is where I do a whole bunch of terraforming. When I started this, I wasn't really sure exactly what I wanted to do. I just knew that I wanted it to be on a different level than the rest of the zoo has been so far, even just a little bit. I knew that the space that I had to work with meant that I couldn't do anything too dramatic. I did know that I wanted the path leading to the Savannah Dome to be a bridge, so that's what I started with. I used the terrain stamp to dig this massive hole so that it was all on the same level, and then I had this idea that I wanted it to be this big waterway with a massive waterfall at one end. So I moved the terrain stamp back and added in a whole bunch of different layers so that the terrain wasn't just all at one level. I smoothed the different levels out, and then I was playing around a lot with how I wanted the water to sit. I wanted the waterfall to be on one level and then to obviously flow down into a second level, but I wasn't sure how high I wanted that second level to be, or if I wanted the two bodies of water to be separate or connected, because if I make the top level one separate from the second level, it's a lot easier to manage if I have to make changes at a later point. I did end up deciding to separate them, and then I created essentially a ramp for the animals to get in and out of the water because I did want them to be able to access it. I wasn't sure if it would work because I didn't have the animals to test, and that's because I didn't have any barriers in place at this point. So I just did a rough estimation of what I think would work for the animals, but I'm pretty sure I have to go back and change it a little bit later anyway, just smooth it out and make it usable. Once I'd mapped out how I wanted the water to be on one side of the bridge, I then had to go back in on the other side and start working on where the water was actually going to lead to, and I decided that I wanted it to kind of wrap around the edge of the Savannah Dome I changed the terrain next to the waterway as well, so that it was like one step lower. I just feel like my zoo is very flat at this point, and I didn't want that to continue. So I'm going to be playing around a lot more with leveling and terrain in my zoo going forward. And then I went back to the waterfall now that I knew that there wasn't going to be an issue with the water later on. I built out a massive rock wall by layering this one type of rock. It's not going to be massively visible, so it didn't really matter that they all looked the same, but I did go through and try and make some adjustments to it so that there was some variation in the rocks. And then I took a different type of rock and used it to cover the surface of the other rocks, because in reality a rock wall underneath a waterfall is usually pretty smooth due to the water erosion. Once the rock face was finished, I added in the water special effects. I didn't want it to look like a flat line, so I added the effects at different points on the rock wall. And once I added back the water on the second level, I think it came together really nicely and the waterfall looks super realistic. Then I continued the rock face along the top level just to blend it all in together. For this part, I tried to use a whole bunch of different types of rocks because the water isn't really falling on them, they haven't eroded as much, and they're definitely going to not be the same. I then made some massive adjustments to one of the main pathways, the left-hand side one that leads out of the welcome center. Again, I really wanted to play with layers and levels in my zoo, and I thought no time like the present. So I deleted the whole pathway, I flattened that so that it matched the water edge level, and built some stairs to lead into that part of the zoo from the welcome center instead. And then I built that pathway all the way to the water's edge next to the Savannah Dome, and then followed the pathway around the water so that it also wrapped around the Savannah Dome. I wanted to make the bridge feel more bridge-like, so I needed to put it into a different pathing material. I went for this dark wood because I really like the idea of it being a wooden bridge, and I've been using a lot of dark wood throughout the zoo just as like little accents. I added railings on, and to make it even more realistic, I added in a wooden column underneath the bridge, just as like structural support. At this point, I decided that I really needed animals in the habitat so that I could test that everything was working as expected. I really needed to make sure that they could actually get into the water and that they could swim underneath the bridge, because their habitat is going to extend out into that point as well. So I started working on the barriers. I used a lot of invisible barriers because I wanted there to be mostly a massive rock wall to kind of keep the animals in, but at certain points I also use the breeze block wall so that it blends in with the llama enclosure and the little food court next door. Obviously that changes quite extensively, as you saw from the previous video where I basically just changed the entire llama enclosure. I had a bunch of difficulty getting the barriers to work around the water and underneath the bridge, which I'm sure you can see from how long this section of the video is, and it didn't even end up mattering because I did decide to extend the habitat all the way around the Savannah Dome to the other end. And that's really because I was getting annoyed with how the barriers were working, or well, not working, but also as I discovered later on when I brought the animals into the habitat, if I'd done it the way that I was originally going to do it, these animals would not have had nearly enough space that they actually needed to have. Okay, so now I'm working on adding in a second viewing area for this particular habitat. There is already one that is mostly unintentional, which is the bridge, but obviously that would be incredibly inconvenient if that's the only place that you can view these animals, because it's going to absolutely crowd the bridge. I of course had no idea what I wanted to do with the second viewing point. I knew that it had to be off the main footpath because just like the bridge, it's going to be really inconvenient and crowded. So I was playing around with a whole bunch of different shapes. I even tested out making some adjustments to the terrain so that the guests could walk all the way down to the waterfront, but I very quickly threw that idea directly into the trash can because I would have had to go through the whole process of removing the water from the little river so that I could make adjustments to the terrain, and then I would have had to put it back, and I didn't want to go through all of that process only for the water not to work at the end of it. I did try out one more idea, which was to bring the path all the way down to the river's edge on the same same level as the existing terrain, but have it kind of curved. And then I just put this rock wall around the edge of it. The rock wall took a really long time to build, and I really hated the look of the path. So I didn't include it in the speed build, but you will be able to see it in the background while I'm working on other stuff. And then I do go back and change it. So what I'm doing now while I'm trying to think of what I wanted to do with the other viewing section is finishing off the rest of the barriers around the habitat. So you'll see I built this massive rock wall where the waterfall is, but I didn't want this entire barrier to be the rock wall. I wanted to break it up a little bit, add some contrast. So part of it is also this breeze block wall. On the other side of the habitat, I used just the standard concrete barrier. I do think I go in and change that a little bit later so that it looked a little less boring. And then the barrier next to the pathway, I did the same wall that I built for the flamingo habitat and also the piggies section of the zoo. So I just used that light wooden plank wall and then put a dark charcoal grey plaster along the edges. And now this is where I go in and make some massive changes to the second viewing section. So I delete all of those rocks and the pathway as well. And I keep the pathway really basic. I don't change anything to do with the terrain, and I use the 8-meter tile width and just pop in 2 squares. And there you go. You would have seen me remove not only the concrete barrier, but also the light wooden barrier as well. And I completely changed the barriers so that they only come to the water's edge. And now I'm just going through and including a whole bunch of rocks to build out a natural barrier for the animals instead. I added a whole bunch of rocks to the bridge area to make it feel a little bit more built in to the landscape. I'm not actually sure if I keep that. I think that gets removed a little bit later anyway as well. And then I also added in a bunch more rocks to the waterfall area to make that also look a lot more built into the landscape as well. Using the magic of video editing, I'm now going to jump ahead to where the rocks have all been added to the water's edge because this took a really long time and it's super boring to narrate. And ta-da, suddenly there are rocks. And then I just include some additional foliage to fill in the remaining gaps in that corner. Okay, now moving on to the part in the video where we actually have the animals inside of the habitat. And the very first thing that I checked for was any escape routes, of which there were many. Most of them just because I badly placed the barrier or the null barrier. So I went through and fixed that up first, and then I checked again and fixed up any barrier issues with the rock walls that I could see. This led to me adding in a whole bunch more rocks around the perimeter of the Savannah Dome. And since the next little section is also me just going through and making a whole bunch of adjustments to the barrier until there are no escape routes, I'm going to skip ahead again to the next section in the speed build. So at this point, I've built out the general structure of the habitat and included a whole bunch of barriers to ensure that the animals can't escape from the habitat. And now I'm just going through and adding in a whole bunch of foliage on the rock wall face to break up the grey. I personally think that it's really satisfying to hear and see all of the bushes be placed, but please let me know down below if you would like me to cut these sorts of sections of the video out or trim them down and make them shorter. You'll see that I start off with one type of plant and really just go to town covering as much of the rock wall as I think looks good with this plant. And then I went through and added in a few other types of plants, usually bushes that have a different height to them to add some variation. And then I finish off by including another type of plant that is usually quite similar to the first plant but is a different color, so it adds some color contrast as well as the height contrast from the bushes that I add. I go through and do this throughout the entire habitat as well, not just the rock wall. I really like to include as much foliage as possible in my habitats, at least as much as the animal's preference will allow. Habitats always look so much prettier when they're filled out. I mean, in my opinion. I think that I'm really going to struggle when I have to move to the desert biome and have to try and build out habitats that don't look boring in a desert biome, using no plants. Luckily for me and my absolute love of plants, the Springbok, Thomson Gazelle, Sable Antelope, they all really love a lot of foliage in their habitats. So I was really able to go to town, which I think you can tell given the length of this section. I really do just go through and include the absolute maximum that I possibly can into this habitat of plants. I included some big trees as well in their main habitat section. I didn't go with particularly tall trees for this section because I really just didn't feel like it needed it with the savanna dome in the background. Once I'd finished adding in as many plants as I possibly could, I moved on to adding in the things that the animal needs to survive and have a good time. So I placed a whole bunch of food trays down for them. I anticipate a lot of animals coming into this section, so I wanted to make sure there was more than enough food available for all of them, and also just some enrichment items for them. They do get the interspecies bonus, thankfully, and they all tend to like the same kind of toys, so that was really easy to include. The next thing I did was include some education devices, so a couple of habitat boards in the bridge viewing zone. I did run into a little bit of difficulty where one of the boards was outside of the power zone, so I had to include an additional transformer. Where I decided to place it was absolutely temporary. When I build out the next habitat section, I of course include a new power device and water filter, so when that gets added in, it covers the missing area for this habitat board. Okay, now we're moving into a fun section where I build out the second guest viewing area and make it look all fancy. This is where I decided to expand their space because the animals were telling me that they actually did not have enough space, and I really want them to have more than enough. So I make some big adjustments to the existing barrier, and then I added in a rock kind of as a ramp for the animals to easily get up into this second section after their little swim, because there was absolutely no way that I was going to go through and touch the water and make more adjustments to the terrain, especially since there is a barrier right next to it as well. So this was a handy little workaround. Unfortunately, something that I did discover was that the animals were going to be unable to swim underneath the bridge. It wasn't high enough, so I was definitely going to have to make some adjustments to the water, which I did. I lowered the water level and made some adjustments to the rocks so that they could still get onto it, and that fixed the problem. They were able to get to the other side of their habitat through the river. Okay, back to making things look nice. Next to the second viewing area, I went through and I replaced the barriers that were the concrete wall with a rock wall instead to make it look more natural. But the next issue that I was experiencing was that the animals were refusing to swim past a certain point, and I was making as many adjustments as I could to get them to do it, but I realized very quickly that the river edge was simply not wide enough, and in order to get them to swim through it, I was going to have to make some serious adjustments. So I decided that the staff path that wraps around the outside of the Savannah Dome was going to have to be removed, which was okay for the staff path because the staff can walk along a normal path, which does already go all the way to the back of the Savannah Dome, so it was very easy to connect their staff area with the main path, and that's exactly what I'm doing here. So once I connected the two paths, I moved the rocks out of the way and started making some adjustments to the terrain. I was hoping that this widening would be enough to get them to swim all the way to the end, but unfortunately it wasn't, and so I ignored the situation for now and moved back to the second guest viewing area. You can tell that I was extremely indecisive about exactly how I wanted this to look and plan out by all the jumping around to the different areas that I'm doing. I stole the roof that I used here from the other mini food court area and included my standard light wooden beams along the edges, as well as the dark columns to hold it up. I included some vending machines. It's not the main intention of this area, but it doesn't hurt to improve their needs, especially when they keep complaining to me about how hungry and thirsty they are walking around my zoo, which I suppose makes sense. I don't really have a whole lot of food court areas, but again, work in progress, and I think that I've improved it dramatically. So to close the gap between the path and the barrier, I built in my standard charcoal grey plaster blocks, which I used to hide the charity bins and habitat education boards as well. And then since I already had the food and drink vending machines in this area, I also included a couple of wooden picnic benches for guests to sit on and eat their food at. A couple of garbage cans as well, just to ensure they're not throwing their trash on the ground. I swear, if you don't have a garbage can within 3 centimeters from them, they will just throw their trash on the ground, no care for the animals whatsoever. And then I added in one extra column in the center of the roof on each side just to, you know, make sure it's structurally sound. Then I decided that I didn't like how the front of the viewing section was laid out. So I cleared away some rocks and extended the glass barrier around the corner, made some adjustments so that there were no gaps in the barrier, and then extended the grey blocks all the way along the edge. This is everything that I have for you today. It seems like kind of a random habitat section that I've built out in this video, but I think that it blends together really nicely in the next section of the zoo that I'm building out in the next few videos. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave your thoughts below, like, comment, subscribe, and have a lovely day. Bye!